If you had to guess which was the first country in the Eastern Bloc to start manufacturing and selling Coca-Cola, what would you say? Probably the Soviet Union. Maybe Yugoslavia? Well, you'll be wrong, because the first communist country that Coca-Cola conquered was none other than Bulgaria. But how did the American soda company manage to get through the Iron Curtain in the middle of the 1960s? Strangely enough, it involves a food specialist, a former spy turned CEO, and a Russian prince. In the middle of the 1960s, the Cold War was at its coldest. The Berlin Wall was up, the space race was on, and the Cuban Missile Crisis was just a few years ago. But there was another battle, the fight to put a Coke bottle in the hand of every single person on Earth. Having already conquered post-World War II Western Europe, Coca-Cola had its eyes set on the Eastern Bloc.
Look at this, son. All virgin territory, 300 million thirsty comrades, Volga boatmen and Cossacks, Ukrainians and outer Mongolians, panting for the pause of refreshers.
At the time, Coke was still a mysterious drink in Eastern Europe, seen as a symbol of American imperialism. Bulgarian propaganda newspapers run headlines such as "Americans drunk on Coca-Cola," leading many people to believe that it's actually an alcoholic drink. The communists were determined to block all Western influence. In 1962, Bulgaria was negotiating for soda manufacturing machines with the French company Cifal. At the time, the only soda in the country was the lemonade produced in homemade shops. The company negotiating on the Bulgarian side was called Taksim, short for Trade, Export and Import. Taksim was a free capitalist island in a planned market economy. It was created specifically to seek import and export with capitalist countries, and as such was given decision-making autonomy and significant tax reduction. The head of the company was a man called Georgi Naidenov, a former intelligence officer who had assignments in Egypt and Turkey before assuming the new CEO position. He requested that a specialist from the food industry management assist in the talks. Fate would have it that the only available expert at the time was Toncho Mihaylov. Mihaylov had the education and the expertise, but his career was consistently being sidelined because of his family background and the fact that he wasn't a member of the Bulgarian Communist Party. Nevertheless, during the talks, Mihaylov impressed the CEO with his knowledge and professionalism so much that Naidenov gave him the job of soda factory director. Mihaylov was one of many people back then who were deemed unreliable by the communist regime because of their background. However, instead of keeping a low profile, Mihaylov would often take initiative at work and speak out against the bad decisions of his superiors. During the 50s, he was working in a wine cellar when an order came from none other than the USSR. A high-quality wine liquor was to be produced for the Soviets, but they had one important demand: no heirloom varieties. Heirloom varieties are old, traditional type of crops that farmers have saved and replanted for generations, staying the same over time. However, Mihaylov knew of a local variety that tasted better than the other ones. He produced 200 tons of wine using the banned grapes. Once the authorities found out, he was charged with sabotage against the Soviet Union. He was offered the deal: either plead guilty now and get 20 years in prison, or wait to hear back from the Russians if they like the wine. However, if he chose to wait and they hated the wine, he would get the death penalty. Mihaylov chose to wait. 2 months later, the answer came back. They liked the wine and they wanted more the next year. In 1964, Mihaylov, now acting director of the soft drinks factory, was sent for 10 days for training in Paris. Back then, traveling to a Western country wasn't easy. Mihaylov had to get instructions from the police on who he's not allowed to meet or talk to while abroad. However, one fateful evening in a Parisian bistro would redefine the rest of his life. He sat down and ordered an orange soda. At the time, Bulgaria was already producing orange drinks, and he wanted to try what the West had to offer. He really liked what they brought him and looked at the name. The drink was called Fanta. Unfamiliar with the name, the next day Mihaylov asked his hosts from Sifal to take him to the company that makes Fanta. They did just that. However, when they arrived at the offices of Coca-Cola, Mihaylov was shocked and insisted that he didn't want to go to Coca-Cola. Nevertheless, the French told him that Fanta is produced by the American company. Mihaylov was very nervous to be meeting with the enemy, but it was too late to back out now. He was received by the vice president of the European division, Alexander Makinsky, who gave him a royal welcome. Makinsky was quite familiar with royal welcomes. Born in a noble lineage in 1900, he attended a prestigious boys' school in St. Petersburg. However, he had to leave Russia following the October Revolution of 1917. Makinsky was a suave, dapper white Russian who often attended the banquets of the European elite. He even got acquainted with famous writers such as Exupéry and James Joyce throughout his life in Paris. In the late 20s, he became a representative for the Rockefeller Foundation. Following the Nazi invasion of France in 1941, he was recalled to Washington, where he assisted in the escape of several scholars from the Nazi regime. After the war, he returned to Paris and was hired by Coca-Cola, who believed that he can help in their European expansion. In 1949, a strong anti-Coke campaign was led by the French Communist Party, backed by the winemakers. They introduced a bill to prohibit the import, manufacture, and selling of Coca-Cola in France, Algeria, and the French colonial empire. Ironically, they were afraid of Coca colonization. The winemakers, on the other hand, were afraid that Coca-Cola would replace wine as the nation's favorite drink. Makinsky was instrumental in defeating the opposition, and eventually Coca-Cola was allowed to operate in France. Upon hearing that a representative from Eastern Europe was coming, Makinsky assumed that Bulgaria was interested in distributing the brand. Believe it or not, Coca-Cola's biggest enemy at the time wasn't communism, it was Pepsi. The two colas were engaged in a cold war of their own, and they both had their eyes set on the huge market that lied beyond the Iron Curtain. Makinsky and Mihaylov hit it off instantly. They were both Eastern Europeans, and they spoke Russian. Makinsky gave his guest a tour of the factory and invited him to dinner. On one hand, Mihaylov was happy that he found a familiar person, but on the other, he was very concerned about what the Bulgarian authorities will do to him if they ever find out about this unauthorized excursion. At the end of the evening, Makinsky invited himself to Bulgaria. Panicked, Mihaylov asked him to call before he comes over. When Mihaylov came back to Bulgaria, he had to write a report about his trip. That was standard practice at the time. However, he didn't mention his visit to Coca-Cola out of fear. His secret didn't stay hidden for long, because only a week later, Makinsky called pressuring him about visiting Bulgaria. Makinsky was probably the first person to ever make contact with someone from the other side, and he wasn't going to let it go that easily. Mihaylov decided to confess to the CEO of Texim. He tried to minimize the damage by suggesting that they only negotiate for Fanta and not Coca-Cola. But having tasted Coca-Cola abroad, Naidenov decided to go all out. He rang directly the head of the Bulgarian state and government, Todor Zhivkov, and told him about Mihaylov and the arriving Coca-Cola man. Zhivkov ordered Naidenov and Mihaylov to come to his office in 1 hour. Going in, they saw another member of Politburo waiting alongside Todor Zhivkov, which made them uneasy. The other guy joked with Naidenov that he was supposed to make lemonade and now he wants to make alcohol, repeating the false belief that Coke contains alcohol, and got very upset when Naidenov told him that Coca-Cola is lemonade. Regardless of this guy's feelings, the decision was, as it always is in a totalitarian state, the dictators. Surprisingly, Zhivkov said yes. We don't know if he consulted with Moscow beforehand or decided to take a chance. In any case, his decision meant that Bulgaria would become the first country in the Eastern Bloc to produce and distribute the iconic American soda. A week later, Makinsky and 2 other VPs arrived in Sofia, and the contract was signed soon after. They even had a few cold Coca-Colas on the way to the Vituša mountain. The company had only one request, that the drink is sold in the iconic bottle. 1 million empty bottles would be delivered from Italy until we start producing them locally. Bulgaria had only one request that will go down in history. The label had to be written in Bulgarian, making it the first time that the Coca-Cola logo would be written in a different alphabet, the Cyrillic. The first bottling factory opened in Sofia at the end of 1965. 2 more factories would follow in Plovdiv and Varna. Soon, Coca-Cola would arrive in other communist countries, including the USSR. What happened after? Taksim was shut down in 1969 by the demand of the Soviet Union, because it was getting too profitable and powerful. The production of Coca-Cola was moved to one of the state's soda factories. Georgy Naidenov would later be sued for the illegal arms trade done by the company. Taksim ships were used to deliver arms to the National Liberation Front of Algeria. He got a 20-year sentence, but was released in 5. After the fall of communism, Toncho Mihaylov became known as the man who brought Coca-Cola to Bulgaria. He was the subject of many interviews, a documentary, and even published a book about the experience. Over the years, some people have questioned Mihaylov's claims. After all, it sounds very improbable that so many coincidences would happen so that Coca-Cola would accidentally enter Bulgaria. Surely, the French hosts would have told Mihaylov who owns Fanta and wouldn't just take someone from a communist country to the headquarters of Coca-Cola. Or maybe the whole thing was orchestrated by Naidenov and Mihaylov was just an unknowing pawn. Or maybe it's all true. Personally, I believe the story. After all, stranger things have happened. Thank you all for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.